I just wanted to, before we start, I just wanted to recap from what we discussed before. We we discussed last time that the brain, as the brain is growing, it's got a capacity to be influenced and changed in relation to the responses of the parents and the responses of the environment. So this feedback process is extremely important for child's brain development. And we'll go to that a bit deeper this time around. So I just wanted to say that basically the brain consists of nerve cells. It's just individual neurons that there are billions of them in the brain. And each of those make contact to about 10,000 other neurons. So the actual number of connections that we've got is just astronomical. But within those connections, now we've got at least two different levels of connection in a large scale unit that consists of, tens or hundreds, thousands of neurons. And it's actually unknown how many of these, exactly how many of these modules exist, but a good estimate of that will be hundreds of them. So for each of these modules, all the neurons connected with the other ones, the direct connection with one or two removes. So it's pretty tight connection, so they can process stuff. In other words, when you start looking at someone's face, the face recognition area is somewhere else. But when you try to understand their face, look at the color of their eyes, the color of their hair, color of their skin, these are different networks and modules that come in connection together. And the amazing thing is that these modules are plastic. So they can chop and change in many different ways. And we go to that later. It's called network collapse. I want to discuss that. But also, we discussed how, as the brain develops, its structure actually develops. One of the most important areas is the prefrontal cortex. That basically, we'll go through that a bit more details this time around. How it's extremely important and susceptible to the way parents respond. So when the child's born, the particular area called that we do our primitive emotional processing called amygdala, and the area that we use for our memory imprinting and memory recall and memory writing is called hippocampus. But earlier on in our lives, these places are switched. So hippocampus processes our emotions early in childhood, and amygdala processes our memory in early childhood as it develops. So, and then as they evolve, the brain of the child evolves, these systems reorganize and go back. So the brain, essentially what I'm saying is that the brain is extremely, extremely, extremely susceptible to behavior of the parents. It responds in development to the behavior that parents subject their kids to. So basically, this is a summary of what we discussed last time. Now, we go to the next stage of our discussion. In 2856, God says, you cannot guide the ones you love. God is the only one who guides in accordance with his will, in accordance with his knowledge of those who deserve the guidance. And in 7:30, God says, some he guides while others are committed to straying. He's the most important part of the stuff that I want to say, because the guidance to submission belongs to God. And we know that he guides some and commits to straying some other ones. But we have to remain a fertile ground to develop a righteous kids, to develop a righteous kid. And one of the most important things, and we'll come to that, is transcendent thinking. But I'd like to read you a quote before we get on to that. This is by Albert Einstein. The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. He to whom the motion is a stranger, who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead. His eyes are closed. The insight into the mystery of life, coupled, though it be with fear, has also given rise to religion. To know what is impenetrable to us really exists, manifesting itself as the highest wisdom and the most radiant beauty, which our dull faculties can comprehend only in their most primitive forms. This knowledge, this feeling, is at the center of true religiousness. So, invoking an awe and letting your children having this discussion with them, we'll go and I'll describe that into a lot more detail a bit later, would actually develop the brain, increase the number of networks. It is estimated that every time you take your kid through a transcendent learning, you end up creating between 2 to another 10,000 new connections in the brain, new connections. So just imagine how interconnected your networks globally can become. And that's what I mean. God's the one who guides, but also God's give you that child to as a fertile ground for a submission. So basically, this brain development and the cognitive development that go hand in hand. You got two, and I am basically summarizing, simplifying. It's a parental interaction and cultural influences. Now, these two are extremely important. With parental interactions, the kid goes through this feedback process, right? And develops mental abilities such as speech, and reasoning skills, and so on and so forth. And that actually develops the way the child is learning. So developing mainly the prefrontal cortex, the attentive areas of the brain. The cultural processes also are important. Cultural processes basically have, again, the feedback processes onto the parents. So when you have a very rigid religious society that has no tolerance, basically it commands that the members in that society obey these archaic laws and oppressive systems. So no parents actually wants to see the child, go and gets executed, for example. So what they do is they basically tailor the feedback from earlier on in the childhood to maintain a child at a level that they don't come in contact with harm in an abusive uh, dictatorship, brutal, tyrannical societies that we have so around the world. So the cultural influences are extremely important, but depending on where we come from, I'll discuss later how these cultural influences actually form and shape the child itself. But these cultural influences actually form the parents, which then form the child. So the importance of which is when you start looking at these oppressive societies, you look at the role of women, the oppression of women. They stick women in Hessian bags and they drag the mother through oppressive processes, take her rights away, and you can see Afghanistan, stop her from getting educated. And the purpose behind that, these cultural influences at the hands of these regimes, the purpose for that is to basically alter the family setting, because in those societies, it's mainly the role of education is held by mother. So once you condition and oppress the woman, then that woman is going to be teaching the children in the rights of that culture. And the feedback processes we discussed then again influences the development of the child's brain, because now it's getting those influences from the parent, these toxic influences from the parent, and they behave appropriately after that, because we tend to adapt. And part of that adaptation is we're going to go through is exactly how the brain works through that. So the parental interaction that we call a more knowledgeable other, and the more knowledgeable other always has a commanding role in developing the brain of your child. Knowledgeable other could be uh, a elder member of the family, or a teacher, perhaps, but primarily it's the parent. So how does that work in that respect? You get involved in appropriate feedback. You give your child appropriate feedback, right? So that involves having a collaborative dialogue. So earlier on in the your child's 2 years old now. Hopefully, the child can stand, talk, and walk. And when you have an issue, you kneel down at an eye level. So when a child 2, 3 years old wants to talk to you, wants to show you something, or having an argument, what we do is we kneel down and look at eye level with the child. So in a way, you are developing the child's self-influence. So the child is now learning, the prefrontal cortex is now learning um, how to respond given the feedback from the parents. You're preparing that, still developing. Like the age of 25, 26, these particular parts of the brain develop. So that is the more knowledgeable interaction with the child. So the child becomes more attentive, and the reaction of the child becomes calmer, because inherently there is a concept, even in human psychological development, is inherently physically children have fear of the parent, because parents control their lives. They are little. They have no power compared to the parent. They always have to look up, right? And they've got basically no protection against the parent if that parent becomes abusive. So inherently, the child has that, and it's something that you don't you want to basically replace that with love and affection. You're taking your child through a different stage of development, because this is exactly what God does. What God does essentially through his scriptures is give us a way to him. God starts the Quran with his name, most gracious, most merciful. It's a statement of love and affection. So we go to him. And this is exactly how the more knowledgeable other would respond to the child. If you want your child to be receptive to God's word, at least that part, then you can easily set the boundaries. Boundary setting becomes quite difficult for many people, and for some other cultures, it involves a punishment, and physical punishment or psychological punishment, basically amount to torture for a kid. So what does that does do that is it shuts down the brain. In boundary setting, punishment has no role, but guidance has. God says in the Quran that I do not destroy a community without having sent to them a messenger first. So before that, the process of guidance is a process that you don't really want to um, uh, give, serious consequences to a child that makes a mistake, or basically trying to understand how the world works, right? And for example, if a child throws a tantrum, the child's acting out. The child's acting out, and everyone goes, "Oh, the child's acting out. You got to be serious about that. You got to be worried about that. You got to stamp that out and nip that in the bud, or whatever they say." Which that's not true. The kid just doesn't have a vocabulary, just hasn't evolved that emotional response yet to understand what's happening. I'm upset. I'm upset with what you do. I wanted this and you gave me that. And you're forcing me to have that. I didn't want it because this upsets me. Mom, dad, this upsets me. Right? When you notice the way God is training us, he says there is no compulsion in religion. You're not compelled to do anything at all. So why do we then go and, you know, force our kids in one way or another? Oh, it's terrible. I'm a submitter. My son's out there doing whatever the other things, and what has that got to do with the way you behave towards your child? Child doesn't belong to you anyway. We discussed that on the previous discussion. And that's very important for the self-esteem development in a child. The trust you have with a more knowledgeable other, with the parent, would increase your self-esteem. And we go through the complexes. It actually, um, we could have a negative effect on developing of the self-esteem, right? And finally, still the role of the parent or the more knowledgeable to engage in transcendent discussion, engaging, going beyond the existence of context to look at what Einstein said, to see how that approach to God actually develops the brain in a totally different way. Now, the cultural influences, this is where the positive aspect of that is where the submitter, God believing communities will play a central role in the process of making a meaning. So, what does that mean to a child? Basically, develop the values, beliefs, and problem solving skills. So, we've got an issue. I've had this discussion with many people on the server when they have a problem. We go through the Quran, we find the verses that relates to that particular issue, and we go through it and reflect on it. And as a result, that community, that cultural and community influence becomes an important positive feedback. But as I described, the other form of cultural influences also would have a negative impact on the developing child through the parents. For example, in the Taliban process, they brought back, whipping, lashing, stoning to death, and so on and so forth. But they actually forced the kids to watch it. When ISIS had some regional control in Iraq, they used to actually force people to come and watch the beheadings and the tortures and whatever they did to them. That's a very terrible way of giving feedback to that child. So both of these things are extremely important in development of cognitive development of the child. So what is this learning? Where does this occur? It is called, so the parent would then, once it gets involved with the kids go through what Freud called guided learning. So once the parent or the more knowledgeable other is involved with teaching a child, this happens through a zone in the child called zone of proximal development. Now, the zone of proximal development is basically the gap between what a child can do independently and what they can achieve with guidance. Right? So, and the child wants to be involved. So then the parent shouldn't be running all the time and trying to finish a task for a child. Oh, let me do it. I can do it better for you. No, you're not helping. You're actually destructive to the child's development. Because as the brain develops, the internal system, it's called proprioception. You're understanding internally where your arms are. You can close your eyes and you know where your arm is situated in space around you. So you are aware internally of internally aware of the position of your limbs, your arms, where you are, and how to control yourself, so on and so forth. That also early childhood. It's the feedback from the muscles, from the, how you press to cut a paper with scissors and how you press to cut a cardboard. These are little feedback processes that go through the muscle and sensory system and develop the brain. So it's got to happen within the zone of proximal development of the child. And then I iterate again. what the child can achieve independently and what they can achieve with guidance. For example, I remember when my son was 3.5 years old, we got some flat pack boxes. We cutting them open. I had a box cutter, sharp stuff. But he's insisting to have one. I said, well, it's too sharp, Baba. I'll give you a different knife. You can work with it. So I gave him a blunt knife. And all I said was just be very careful because, it's a hard cardboard and everything else. Not to hurt yourself. That's all I said, but I was watching it. So he does that. He gets this blunt thing and he goes in there. It's a hard thing. And he's going through enjoying himself until he actually hit himself. And he did a bit of even that blunt thing because he's pushing it too hard. And then he cried. So I picked him up and I soothed him and everything else. But nonetheless, he had that experience. So over parenting won't allow that zone to develop properly, right? Over killing, trying to do stuff for your kid. Um, and the other thing that the parent does is that interprets the cultural responses to the world, because these are complicated issues, and the early childhood development depends on people who believe in God, right? Submitters, many of people who would be listening to this may come from different religions, but nevertheless, they believe in God, right? So, and every one of us live in complicated cultures. So that interpreting the complex situations are extremely important. And this is, we're talking about at times of a kid where their learning rate is at maximum, absolutely maximum. So, and that maximum rate of also developing the brain. So how does this work in the context of belief in God? If we have in a submitter family or a righteous family or a family who believes in God and lives by God's guidance and laws, the child grows up seeing the immediate society in one way, and then the society is influenced because they live in a different society, like society with Muslims, with Christians, with Jews, submitters, and so on and so forth. How would then the parent interpret that? And I've come across parents, uh, Muslim parents, whose approach is extremely horrible towards trying to interpret the cultures uh, where the kid grows at in the West. So, for example, my son goes to a Christian school, but he's a submitter. So we read both the Quran and the Bible. And this is extremely important that he actually gets to know it. So we read both of them. For example, stories of Jonah, Job, Joseph. These are identical stories where you get a bit more detail in the Bible and you get these references in the Quran. But nevertheless, one of the things that I've been wanting to show my son that it is all from one God. It doesn't matter what we call in our language, but these are the respect that we have for these other religions. So you don't make an enemy of everyone else. And I've noticed how people, they use fear-based systems in Islamic families. It's the same with Hindu families. In fact, uh, one of uh, my cousin's daughter wanted to marry an Indian guy. I mean, she's German, comes to Australia, met this guy who's Australian, but he's from a Hindu background. And then you should see the kerfuffle. Just like, you could got an enemy out there. So, um, so, so the more knowledgeable of the parent would then has additional way of developing a child's brain by making appropriate interpretation of the kid's culture. And I said to you that uh, even during Christmas time, I saw these other families. The kids were completely depressed. Well, it doesn't have to be that. You can appropriately describe this. So, how does this affect the development of the brain? Oh, just before we go there, also, it is extremely important that the parents also have a healthy relationship. What does that mean? It means that you work in concert with your child. You do not use your child as a weapon uh, against the other parent, knowing that one of the parents may spend more time with the other child, but should basically that bonding process, that learning process comes from both of them. Um, I remember some stupid thing people used to ask me when I was a kid. Do you like your mother? Do you love your mother more or your father more? And it always baffled me. What are these people asking that? So it's important that parent and that, how does that work? That works that the parents within themselves would have to have arrived at a respect for each other. And what do I mean by respect? By respect, I mean that their individuality, their decisions are not questionable and they are not oppressed and told what to do. They're just respected as who they are. They should not be in any shape or form controlled or be under any kind of coercive control, because that's exactly the way that parent would behave towards that child. That is a modality of behavior that parents have, coercive control. That's why mostly the relationships fall apart. So what's the solution to that one? Solution that is very easy is that if you're guided by God, God says in the Quran, the the righteous man, the righteous woman, the patient man, the patient woman, we are all equal spiritually before God. If that is the case, then a marriage that results, to have kids would consist of a new space, not a space that you go in there, okay, marriage is 100%, 50 from the male and 50% from the female. Completely wrong. Marriage is a new space. You have to get respect and live with another person. And they come to you for love and affection. The reason why you sit up and pray, because you seek God's love. The reason why you we're sitting here talking about how we raise righteous kids is because we love God. The whole process of getting together is this love. So marriage then becomes a new space that I call it the 200% space. That means everyone would bring in 100% and would not be compromised. So we learn to create a new space with each other to grow our own brain networks by learning how this space works. In this space, you recall, in this space, you get together for love and affection, not for hate and control. And that is why I thought I mentioned that, because that's extremely important in the way you behave towards your child and teach your child. So in this 200 space, you have no compromise. No one likes compromise. And often in these spaces, it's the female in these relationships that gets compromised. But she has to learn to live with that. And that's actually quite toxic to the brain development and behavior. So you don't want to compromise your kid. But learning that comes before the kid is born. You get to know each other. You get to respect each other. And understand what gaslighting and coercive control means. Just be mindful of God all the time in your life, that you're equal. Because that's exactly true when you start behaving towards your child. And you want to raise that child as a righteous child. Right? So the other aspect of that is totally being honest. We discussed that in the previous discussion as well. Do not lie. Even though you think by lying you're going to help your child. I don't want you to go with this person. They say, no, well, that's my friend. No, I don't want you to go with that person. That's it. You're bad granted. I'm only doing this for your benefit. It's exactly what it is. It's exactly what parents do to each other. And that's a modality of behavior. Because I've got the power. I can control you. I can manipulate you. Rather, try to explain. And that is why the more knowledgeable adult does guidance, not control. Guidance and control are two different things. Guidance, God teaches us how to do. Control is what we do. God says that if I wanted, I would have made everyone one congregation. But I didn't. Well, you want that? So it's important because, as I said, in many aspects, the societies affect a female role and affect the male role and dictate what they should be. And this basically is that complexity of interaction with your child, whether you want to allow them to understand that or not. It's going to be quite bad for them if they don't. So what we do, again, we engage in coercive control of the children because they're going to go again there and get hanged. I mean, you can see in the Islamic countries, quite rife, these things. So how does this behavior, and I'll go back to transcendent thinking to see how that level of God basically develops the brain further. But here, it's quite three important topics. Uh, One of them is called network collapse in relation to brain plasticity. And a cognition does not have a particular shape. It can change itself. We can change. And the next one is kindling principle, which is extremely important in development of anything and anyone. And the third aspect of that is parental connection and brain development as a solid physical connection. I'll go through the parental connection and brain development first. These come out of very solid experiments that probably nowadays, if you wanted to carry it out, you would not get ethics approval to do so. What they did was they got chimpanzees, and which is a closest genetic relatives, and they put them to three distinct groups. The control group was just basically the rest of the tribe. And then the first group was separated from the rest of the tribe by a mesh. So physically it was open, they just couldn't get to each other, like doing a cage with mesh. Then they could put their fingers through the mesh and touch the other ones, the ones that came close to them, but they couldn't interact with the group, but they could see them, hear them, watch them, and sometimes the other ones would come in there and touch them. These guys through the little mesh fence they had, like a chicken mesh, the large one. The second group was actually separated from the tribe by perspex, thick perspex. So they could only see them, but they couldn't hear them. They could not hear the rest of the tribe. They separated with very thick perspex. And the third group were actually not at all with anybody. They couldn't even see the humans. And these are infant from infant to very child, because chimpanzees take about 4 or 5 years. They have to spend with their mothers. So these are, say, about 1 to 2 years old, where they still need being protected. But the third group actually didn't have any connection with anybody, not even the humans. So what they had was they got a little chair thing. They had the sheep woolen sheepskin on it, where the thing went and it slipped, and with a little milk thing that comes out of it, the bottle. And when it falls asleep, the human experimenters, the scientists would go in there and give him again more milk and change the nappy and everything. So he actually doesn't see anyone, and he thinks the mother is that chair with a sheep wool on it. Until they grew up, and first they recorded the behavior. What they did was they pretty much the group that was separated from the rest of the tribe, they integrated very well, and they understood the cultural connection with the rest of the tribe, with the noises they made, they heard, and it was basically integrated pretty much normally. They got assaulted in the beginning a bit, but okay, again, any newcomer to society might experience that. The second group out of the Perspex, there were two of them involved. All they did was they stood outside the group and they huddled each other, shaking and huddling each other. They didn't interact. They couldn't interact. They didn't know each other's scent. And after a while, they tried to go and approach someone else, but they got severely beaten and kicked out of the group. They had no appropriate behavioral control. They didn't learn it. Their brain didn't develop. Where we understand how their brain didn't develop is the third group. Absolutely. In fact, inappropriate. In fact, could not even identify. So they killed them and they sliced their brains. And these micro slices showed quite the same structure with the first group of monkeys who were separated by the mesh. And second ones, the brains, the connections were smaller, and it wasn't as dense as the normal and the first group. The third group, however, was quite interesting. In fact, the networks hadn't evolved. There are big gaps between connections in the brain. I mean, the brain is quite dense, but the density wasn't there. There were actually holes and spaces. So that's why that sense is extremely important. But humans that are a degree higher than any other creature with brain requires that feedback of love before anything else. Because one of the things love does from early childhood would stop that glucocorticoid, this particular stress hormone that has capacity to alter the brain development and brain connection structure. That love and that affection, to understand that our kids are not sophisticated yet. They have to explore the world. If they want to be naughty, that's what a child does. If they break stuff, fine, I'll clean it, but I'll go through it. Look, be very careful. Look, I remember my son one day came in there and I was working, and he comes in and says, "Oh, Daddy, I want to break a bottle." And I'm going, "Oh my God!" And I say, "Yeah, okay. You want to break a bottle?" I said, "Yeah, I want to break a bottle. I want to know what happens." I said, "Okay." I said, "You break a bottle in the shards and everything else, difficult to clean." He says, "I know that, but I want to break a bottle." And I said, "Okay." So God gave me the idea and said, "Okay, well, fine. I got a bottle. I got a clear plastic bag, and I put a bottle in it, and I tied it very well. And I said, okay, now we can break it so you can see what happens." So he stood up up top of the stairs and threw it. And the bottle broke inside the bag. Wow, it was amazing. And he still want to break another one. I said, okay, so this is pretty good now. So got another one. We threw it again. It broke in a different way. So I went through describing to him from originally what I wanted to do. And look at the pattern of break. They don't break the same way, do they? Why don't they break the same way? So we went through the physics of it. Right. So he started learning from what he wanted to do as an experiment. So he did again, and I got um, my phone and recorded in slow motion as well. How this glass breaks into pieces. And we studied that together again. Slow mo. That's it. It's out of his system. So what would my behavior be towards that? Horrific to throw a bottle and, like you got to spend half an hour cleaning everything in there, shards and stuff that will go everywhere. And it's bad behavior. No, you're not going to do it. You're not going to do it. That's it. I'm telling you, you're not going to do it. Go inside. Done. Right? So you're just starting to develop, the kid's starting to develop a complex, which is going to be our next topic. But what does that happen? Because this is the way of parental control. There are submitters that I know from submitters' families that they have behavioral problems. How does that happen? They claim they're righteous, and they are, but they will have behavioral problems. And this is the source of it. Something that they haven't been taught and learned how to absorb it and understand it. The kid has to be loved and safe. These are the two crucial markers for brain development, healthy brain development. Because the brain alters when you subject it to trauma. It's completely weird, different. And we'll discuss that on through network collapse to see how that is possible. And in fact, physically, experimentally, we have shown that it's possible. So we went through the parental connection and brain development. I thought that we've been having this discussion for 1 hour, and I think it's not a bad time to stop and make another event um, for the next time. I'll continue next time. Otherwise, it becomes too complicated, too heavy duty. What do you think, people?